Okay, great. I'm sure people will keep on joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Josh Sarver. I am with Blueland Scientific. Also, here is Rachel Glenister. We're co-organizers for INFA. We are so pleased. So many people have been able to join. We hope that these sessions, these discussions, bring quality insights, really help deepen your understanding of the subject matter, which is so widely interesting. Our next session is, I think, particularly interesting. It is being led by Rebecca Kern. She is the feed testing product manager and strategist at Ward Laboratories. There she reviews feed and forage data for quality and accuracy, promotes the feed testing department through sales and marketing strategies, and consults with livestock producers, among other duties. She is currently vice president of the NIRS Forage and Feed Testing Consortium. Being passionate about producer outreach and education, she presents at producer meetings, collaborates with state extensions, coordinates educational webinars, and writes editorials, which have been published in Progressive Forage, Progressive Dairy Canada, Hay and Forage Grower, and Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. And she recently earned an MBA with a concentration in data analytics. It is my pleasure to introduce Rebecca Kern. Rebecca, please take it away.
All right. Oh, well, thank you for that kind introduction, Josh, and thank you, Rachel, for asking me to speak. I really appreciate this opportunity. So, as you can tell by the title, today we're going to be going and comparing NIR versus wet chemistry methods when we're looking at evaluating forage quality parameters. Sorry, apparently my slide's not wanting to go. There we go. Okay, so the first thing I always like to think about when we are talking about evaluating forage quality is who are the stakeholders when we're providing these forage quality evaluations and reports? And what are these people needing to get out of the information that we are providing to them? So the first group is the group that I work with the most extensively, which is your livestock producers, which my main focus being in Nebraska is beef cattle, and animal nutritionists and livestock producers alike are testing their forages often to ensure that they have the most precise, accurate diets, whether that be determining their supplement or formulating a ration, just to make sure that they're going to get the most economical mix possible. And they're going to ensure that they're meeting animal protein, energy requirements, among other various factors. And then also they might be using hay analysis to compare a couple different hays and weigh their options on which different hays they can purchase. Which brings me to my next group that I also work extensively with, which is the hay producers themselves, the guys that's what they do. They produce hay and they test it because they're going to sell it. And they really want to demonstrate that they have high quality hay so that they can get the best prices. And they can also use those forage reports at the end of the season to improve their own production management. And then the next two groups I work less with, but as wearing my NIRS Consortium hat, as Rachel likes to often say, as opposed to my Ward Laboratories hat, we've got plant breeders that are part of that NIRS Consortium, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And they're going to be evaluating quality traits relative to different genetics. And they're going to be using those reports to track progress within their breeding programs. And then researchers have various reasons that they will be running forage analysis. A lot of that is going to be they're serving those stakeholders that we already mentioned, the agronomist also, that are going to be possibly helping with hay production or forage production in general, corn silage, things like that. We don't want to forget either. So as the title says, we'll be looking at NIR versus wet chemistry methods. Which is going to be acceptable when we are looking at forage quality, protein, fibers, all of those different things. Does it really matter which way we go? So first, we need to understand a little bit about what the basic is of NIR, how it really works. And I know that there's other speakers in this series that are probably going to speak to this more in depth and in detail. So I'm just going to give an overview and as to how NIR works relative to our wet chemistry analysis. So the main principles for chemical analysis is always to be comparing an unknown sample to known samples to determine the concentration of a constituent. Could be protein. In this example on the screen, we're going to be using starch, and you're comparing the known to the unknown to determine what that concentration is. In wet chemistry, typically you're using a standard curve. So I'm really familiar with minerals, so I always think of using an ICAP to determine these. In this situation, we're looking at starch. Of course, we would use instrumentation in the lab, but just as a general, we've got our standard curve here. So you can see that the concentrations of starch, it's getting darker the more highly concentrated it is. And the unknown sample, based on looking at the standard curve, we would guess that it's going to be at about 150 micrograms per milliliter. So NIR takes a similar concept of comparing known to unknown, except instead of utilizing a standard curve, they're using a database of known measured samples and comparing that to an unknown sample. So the way that NIR works is you're shining a light on that sample, and it's going to pass through a filter, and those chemical bonds are going to be structured so that they'll possibly be rotating, and basically the way the light reflects, it's going to hit the detector and it's going to create a spectra. I should have included a spectra, an example on this slide. And so basically you're going to have your spectra of your unknown, and then you're going to have your spectra of your known samples that wet chemistry methods have been ran on. So you know what the crude protein concentration is, you know what the acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber, you know what your concentrations of various constituents are in those samples based on the wet chemistry. And so then you're taking that database and you're comparing what spectra looks similar to the ones in the database, and then that's how you're going to get your value of how much of a certain nutrient is in that forage. So that's the basis. So now the meat and bones of what I was really asked to talk about, which is what's the benefits of running it NIR versus running wet chemistry each time. And so really we're going to start off with a bang with a really huge benefit, which is decreased sample handling and preparation. So when we are handling and preparing our samples, wet chemistry and NIR, essentially the going from the hay bale to the lab portion is going to be the same. We're going to go out and probe our bales according to the standard National Forage Testing Association established procedures, and we're going to combine those hay probes. We're going to submit them in a bag to the lab, and then from there the lab is going to dry those samples down to a specific dry matter. They're going to grind those samples to a specific grind size, and then the samples are going to go off to the lab and the technicians are going to take it from there. So the processing from that aspect is going to be essentially the same when we're talking about forages. But then when we go into the lab, those lab technicians are going to do different things, whether we're running wet chemistry versus NIR. So this slide, the first column, we've got the constituents. And the constituents we chose to show on this slide are similar to a report that you would receive if you were an NIR Consortium member. And so those calibrations, if you were part of that group, you would get those and then be able to report off of, those calibrations. So we're comparing if we were running a consortium NIR analysis versus if we were to run a similar analysis wet chemistry. And so what I have then in the second column is the number of technician touches, the number of times that technician has to touch that sample, and then the time that it takes for each of those analysis to be ran. So like the first analysis, we've got moisture. So the technician is going to weigh the sample out into a pan. They're going to dry the sample, and then they're going to reweigh it to calculate how much moisture was taken off. And that's 2 technician touches, and it takes approximately 3 hours. So then we did a similar thing for each of these different constituents going across. And so what you can see is that if we were to run a similar report wet chemistry and get the same amount of information back, it would be 193 technician touches. And the key to this is that every time a human enters the process, there's room for human error. So that's 193 opportunities for human error, which could be as simple as not waiting for the scale to read correctly, so possibly having something misweighed, or not zeroing out the scale, something like that. Again, like misweighing it, possibly mixing up samples. Of course, I'm not saying that these are common mistakes. Every commercial lab has highly trained technicians that are going to avoid these mistakes, but there is opportunity. And then the next part is, the number of hours that it would take. Of course, each commercial lab has these things running simultaneously, but if they were to run consecutively, it would take approximately 14 days to get your sample back. And so it just kind of is impressive. Most labs' turnaround time is going to be anywhere between 2 and 5 days. So if you are running wet chemistry, that is actually impressive that they can do that, but just realize each technician is running different tests at the same time. They've got multiple tests they're possibly running at the same time for one technician. So that's something to consider. So in conclusion, we're looking at 193 technician touches and quite a bit of time. Then when we look at the consortium, really, we're loading up the cup. We're sticking the cup in the instrument. It can take about 3 minutes to run. Some instruments may be faster. And so we only have one place for error, and it's obviously much quicker, and we're getting the same amount of information back. So comparatively, that's a huge advantage. Of course, we have to run all that wet chemistry stuff for our database of samples, but we don't have to run it on every single sample. So that's a very large advantage right there. Okay, so then the next portion is that, of course, when you're not paying technicians to run 14 days worth of samples, that's a lot of decreased technician time. So that's going to contribute to the cost of analysis. And then, of course, the cost of all the chemicals that we're running in the wet chemistry. So again, I don't do the ordering for my lab. So this was just kind of an estimate we put together, kind of looking at, this is laid out similar to the last slide, kind of looking at the cost inputs, the chemicals. If you look at ADF and NDF, so each ANCOM bag, there's probably $1 there. We're looking at the cost of the acid detergent or the neutral detergent, acetone for drying. When we're looking at starch or amylase treated neutral detergent fiber, we're looking at the cost of enzymes. And then when we're looking at those digestibilities, the NDFD or in vitro dry matter digestibilities, we're looking at inputting rumen fluid, the cost of maintaining those livestock, all of that. And so some of my colleagues at the consortium and others within my own lab, we estimated that to get a report similar to what the consortium is providing on the NIR side of things, it's going to be over $80, and $80 in my estimate is probably even a low estimate. When we kind of put this together, it was pre-COVID, and so we didn't have all the supply issues. So just to give some non-lab people an idea, while I don't do the ordering, I have heard from the lab manager where I work that chemical costs have gone up 6 to 8%, if not more. So this $80 for if we were running this report wet chemistry is probably a conservative value. On the other hand, if we're running the consortium, of course we have the NIR, of course we have the cost of the instrument. If you're purchasing your equations from the consortium, you have that cost. If you're creating your own in-lab equations, you're going to have that cost. But the point being, depending, how many samples you're running through, just the cost alone of the consortium equations, or if you're purchasing them from another source or creating your own, as well as the instrument, we're estimating that it's going to be anywhere between 20 cents and $2 per sample. And of course, that's going to depend how many samples you're pushing through that lab. And of course, the more samples you're pushing through, then the lower your costs become, even if your technician time does increase somewhat because of that. And of course, just kind of a little plug here for the commercial labs that, if you're a producer or a researcher and you're saying, but hey, I'm getting charged 15 to 20 bucks for this, remember that you're also paying for the cost of all of that front end drying, grinding, all of that, and that needs to be done properly by trained personnel. So that's not a cheap part of this either. So that's kind of where that cost is coming from. So just to compare, the costs of running those things for just if you're looking at in the lab. Okay, and so then we've talked about decreased costs in sample handling and prep. We've talked about the decreased cost of analysis. So probably the most disputed thing is NIR repeatable? Is it reproducible? Is it accurate? Is it precise? And the main group that I always hear pushback on this from, and they're not as accepting of allowing NIR to be an acceptable method, is older livestock producers who were around when NIR technology first came about, and it wasn't the most accurate and it wasn't the most precise back then, but technology has improved, and a lot of the commercial labs, as well as of course the whole consortium group, have worked very hard to improve the accuracy. And so at this point, it is something that's acceptable. And so hopefully with these next few slides, you'll agree. So the first thing, when we're addressing repeatability and reproducibility, let's orient ourselves to this slide so that we can understand what we're looking at. So we've got NFTA, National Forage Testing Association, which is the proficiency testing that commercial laboratories do. And so this is just alfalfa hay, and we've got 33 rounds, which means it was done over multiple years. We've got 7 cooperating labs, all of them consortium labs, and all of this data was reported by NIR. Now, the way that National Forage Testing Association works is they have their reference method average, which is this middle green line that you see. And the reference method average is a wet chemistry method that they choose, and they average the labs that run that method and report that method. And so there's multiple methods for different things, so it might not always be all of the wet chemistry combined. So based on that reference method average, then National Forage Testing Association establishes your upper and lower limits for acceptability for passing the test, for saying that this lab is accurate and precise. And so right now we're looking at dry matter. So on the y-axis, we've got the reported dry matter. On the x-axis, we have which round of the proficiency testing that it is. And then all the little dots, those are the 7 labs that reported. So what you can see on this slide, very plain as day, is that across 33 different samples, across 7 labs, not a single one fell outside of the upper or lower ranges of acceptance. So every single lab passed with flying colors, and you can see that most of those dots are very close to that reference method average. So in this case, we would say NIR is definitely acceptable to determine dry matter. Now, this slide, we have the exact same situation except for crude protein. And again, we don't see anything falling outside of the limits of acceptance. And so again, we say NIR is acceptable to use to predict crude protein in alfalfa hay based on this. So same situation, except for we're looking at acid detergent fiber or ADF. You can see in rounds 22 to 25, we do have a few labs that didn't fall within the acceptable ranges. But if you look at the color of the dots, you can see that those are the same groupings of labs, and it's really only 3 rounds out of 33 rounds. And so that's still really good. And so then if you look at that, it looks like it's only 3 labs. You know, if you really did the math on that, you know, that's still a very small percentage that's falling outside. So the majority, the vast majority is all within the acceptable range, and most of them are still right there on the relative or reference method average. So that's great. So, and then same with NDF, we do have a couple of times where it was actually above the upper limit of acceptance. But again, when we're looking at 7 labs, 33 rounds, the vast majority is right there, very acceptable for the NDF. So NIR is an acceptable method to determine NDF. Okay, so this data was actually put together by Dr. Uttam Sahad of the University of Georgia, and it was published as an editorial in Hay and Forage Grower, which I have the link there. If anyone wants the PDF copy of that, I can send that to you for sure. But his conclusion, Uttam Sahad, he's at the University of Georgia, very, very skilled when it comes to NIR analysis. So he says, when NIR calibration models are developed using good science and applied properly. Now remember that, applied properly, that's going to be key to ensuring when we're thinking of our stakeholders, we want to make sure we're applying properly so they're getting accurate analysis. NIR is as accurate as wet chemistry and forage nutritional analysis. So again, I highlighted the applied properly. I do want to address that a little bit. So I don't know, I guess, if David McIntosh is going to end up speaking or not. Hopefully he will be able to tomorrow or something, I'm not sure. But he's going to speak more to this. He would be a good contact if you have questions about this. But here are just some quick keys to ensure that you're applying the NIR accurately. So the first thing is just keeping on top of instrument maintenance. Of course, the main thing is making sure that the lamp is getting changed when needed, only scanning when the lamp's warm, running your daily check cell, and running your instrument diagnostics. So the really cool thing about the instrument that I've got pictured here is that check cell and the diagnostics, it's all internal. So it's really just the click of a button. So just getting in the habit of making sure you're running those things is going to make sure things are running smoothly in your lab. Sample preparation, like I said and mentioned previously, appropriate grind size and appropriate dry matter. Well, that means that it matches up with the calibration set. So if you're purchasing equations, you need to know how to properly process or pre-process those samples for the lab so that what you're scanning is matching up to the samples that are in the database, because that can make a difference on how that spectra is going to appear. And then just scanning a daily bulk sample, what we mean by that is, like in our lab, we're going to take, one big giant hay bale, we're going to grind it to the appropriate grind size, then we're going to homogenize it, and then we're going to run a different part of that homogeneous sample each day so that we can ensure that we're not seeing any drift in our sample. We also recommend scanning pre-packed samples that you know exactly what that's supposed to scan as well. And then making sure you're packing those cups properly to match the calibration as well. So if you don't have enough sample really to run, it's best not to run because you don't want the light shining through that sample, and that's going to obviously skew things. Okay, so I have mentioned before the consortium many times in this presentation, so I just want to touch on that, and this is kind of leading into it. We're talking about properly applying NIR to forage analysis, and that's something that the NIR Consortium, that's their goal, is to standardize the use of NIR for forage analysis. And to that, we've created these guidelines for optimal use. And so everything I mentioned on the last slide, you can find more in detail information in this guideline. You don't have to be a member. You can purchase the guideline on our website, but it just gives really good information for how to guide producers with taking their samples, and then for you as a lab, creating those protocols if you are a lab. Otherwise, so just a little more about the consortium. It's an association of commercial labs, university entities, government researchers, the plant breeders, and instrument vendors, of course. So all of those different groups come together to create this guideline. So then just to kind of explain a little more what the benefits of the membership is going to be. Calibration. So you can see we've got calibrations for legume hay, right? So that's the calibration that we went over when we were looking at the repeatability and reproducibility. We went over alfalfa hay, so that's where that would be the calibrations. Those were used. Grass hay, mixed hay, corn silage, haylage, and there's more. Like we have unfermented corn silage. There's cover crop mix equations in progress, things like that. So that it's different calibrations. For example, we're seeing more interest in knowing carbon to nitrogen. So that's you're also with the international and also we've had a training event going over the guidelines and really getting hands-on as to how to properly, do everything to standardize the use of NIR forage analysis. And then, of course, it's just a huge networking opportunity when you get to meet other members of the consortium. Okay, so I've probably spent a little too much time plugging the consortium here, so we'll move on. So we've talked about decreased sample handling and preparation. We've talked about the decreased cost of analysis. We've established that it is accurate, it is precise, as long as it's properly applied, right? And so then the last 2 points I'm going to just hit on real quickly is that it is a non-destructive method. So you load your cup, you scan your sample, and nothing gets destroyed in that process. So you still have your full amount, and you can go on and run more wet chemistry analysis if you need to. In our lab, the really popular ones are mineral analysis, a full mineral panel, and then also nitrates, which has been especially popular when we're going through droughts like the past year. And unfortunately, it's looking like we're going into another year of that. And then for researchers, a lot of times they do request their samples to be come back to them because they may have grad students that are going to run different things in their lab, or just to keep a library of their samples that they have what they've researched. And then, of course, it is environmentally friendly. There's no chemical waste to dispose of. That's a really huge thing that a lot of times I think does get overlooked. The lack of chemical waste is really, really a huge advantage. So with that, I'd just like to say thanks again to Rachel and Josh and Blue Sun for inviting me to present. And I've got my contact information. If anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and follow up with me. I probably won't be following back up until about next week. But I will follow up with you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Very, very interesting comparisons. I hope everyone got as much out of that as I did. We have a few minutes. If there's any questions, it's a really great time to introduce it, even if you have a little comment or something you'd like to discuss. We will give you a few minutes. Just as a reminder, there's a Q&A tab. It should be at the bottom of your screen. You can just type in whatever your question is, and Rachel or I will read it. We'll share it with the group. I don't see any questions coming in, so we may be good. We'll give everyone just a second. Okay, I don't want anyone middle typing, so I'm like, oh, shut us down. No, it looks okay. All right, great. Thank you, Rebecca. A very interesting talk. We will end here for this session. We have one final session today, which is going to be the panel discussion. We really hope everyone can join us. We have some interesting questions planned to pose to the group. That'll start in about half an hour. So if you have any errands to run or want to get something to eat, it's a great time to do so. And we will see you all again. Oh, well, one quick question. See, I knew it. I think this was just a comment. It says NIR also requires time for sample prep. I think that's meant to be prep. The drying may take several hours.
Yes, so we're comparing NIR with wet chemistry, and wet chemistry also requires that same amount of sample prep. So that's kind of what I'm talking about when I'm saying the drying and the grinding. That's the same process, whether you're running wet chemistry or NIR, at least it should be. So like the guidelines document tells you, your samples need to be dried to a certain amount, and then the ground to the 1 millimeter through the cyclone grinder. And if you're running any fibers, which most of the time, if you're doing forage analysis, especially for quality, you're going to at minimum want ADF and NDF, then you're also going to want to be drying to an appropriate amount. And it's especially like we run the ANCOM bag method. It's still a 1 millimeter cyclone grind size. So the sample prep should, that front end aspect should actually be the same for both. So that's why we don't, everything I was looking at time wise was excluding that, but absolutely that's why labs do charge more, because they're still paying those technicians to be there for the NIR side of things. And then that's also why sometimes you can see longer time going from when you drop off the sample at the lab to when you get it back. So like say a corn silage, for example, they're saying, yeah, it could take hours. Absolutely. Drying can take a couple days sometimes if it's a very wet corn silage or like a grain shop or something like that. So.
Thank you. They followed up with a couple more comments. Please take into account the cost of electricity if we talk about wet fermented forages. And we had one more question. Can a 1 millimeter Christie mill be used in prep for NIR?
A 1 millimeter Christie mill? Okay. I don't recall. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the mills for grinding. I just know, like, in our guidelines document, we recommend going through a Wiley mill first and then a 1 millimeter cyclone grinder. So if a Christie mill is a cyclone grinder, then I would say yes, for your second step, that would work. I don't know what the mode of action of a Christie mill is, I guess. So the brand we have in our lab is a Perton. I don't know if that's what it is, or so I don't know. Someone else probably knows more about the mills than I do.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. I think I might get surprised by another question, but I think that's it for now. And we'll reconvene at the top of the hour with our panel discussion. Rebecca, thank you again.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Bye-bye.